All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lee Roberts. I'm one of the organizers of this seminar series. I'm going to turn it over to Chris Pettit in a few minutes to introduce our speaker, but I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping to get started. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that UNSW is located on the land of the unceded lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any First Nations people who may be joining us today. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I'd just like to ask everybody who's joining us online to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras during the presentation, just because otherwise we see your face huge here in the room. And once we get to the end, you feel free to turn on your camera and your microphone for the Q&A, but you're also welcome at any time to raise your digital hand or put a question into the chat. And Richard Billingsley, who's the other organizer of this series, will be monitoring the chat so we can ask those questions for you or give you a chance to ask when the time comes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Chris Pettit, who's the Director of City Futures, to introduce today's speaker.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the seminar series. We're in the bunker here, here in the City Analytics Lab, and it's a beautiful day in Sydney. And after this presentation, we'll be able to go forth and experience what's happening outside. And I also give my acknowledgement to the Bidjigal people of the Aurora Nation, and give my thanks and acknowledge elders past and present, and the beautiful land that we're on. Ryan's presentation is going to be focused on what's happening in regional housing markets. Housing, as we know, is very topical. It's become increasingly topical. Issues of affordability, resilience, and so forth. Ryan's going to be talking about some of these pressure points that are now making their way to regional locations, particularly post-COVID. We've had a lot of activity and changes in the housing markets. So Ryan is a senior lecturer in the city planning program here at UNSW. He's been associated with the City Futures Research Centre for a number of years. He's a fellow of City Futures. We're very pleased to have Ryan associated with the centre. He has a long history, previously working as a research associate in the centre. He's also previously worked at Western Sydney University as a lecturer. And he's very grounded in his research, having a lot of practical experience as a planner working in government. So it's been a great pleasure to introduce Ryan to give this talk today.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, City Futures, for hosting me today. I'll also acknowledge that we're meeting today on land of the unceded land of the Bidjigal people. And I always like to say, we're gathering here as an educational institute, built environment faculty. We are a school, and so we are really building on literally thousands of years of traditions of coming together in this place to share our knowledge, to better manage our resources. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and future. So today, this afternoon, I've got a bit of a mixed bag for you. Let me get this going. There is going to be some substance to it. I'm going to present some findings from two recently published reports. They came out towards the end of last year. They're the ones you can see on the screen. One was looking at the impact of the floods up in the North Rivers here in New South Wales on the housing system, particularly looking at how those floods had affected people already in situations of facing housing vulnerability. The other report that I'll be presenting the findings of is a report that was largely built on census data. It's a project that's still ongoing, and we basically used the census data to identify unmet need for social and affordable housing in particular. But by breaking it down into some different markets, it allows me to tell a little bit of what's happening in regional parts of Australia as well. And the third thing I'll be drawing on, I've suggested here are some expert observations, which is my euphemism for wild speculation, but hopefully that's okay. We can have a bit of a discussion as we go through. I think the only thing I would, the sort of caveat I would add at the top is I'm not doing these necessarily sequentially. So I, put the caveat at the top to take everything with a grain of salt. I'll try and be clear on what's based on rigorous research and what's the wild speculation, but we'll see how we go. So I have tried to organize this sort of presentation into some components, but broadly speaking, what I'm going to be suggesting is that the regional housing systems, and I will be focusing largely on New South Wales, particularly in this first part, because it's based on research that was looking at the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, but it will have application to other regional markets as well. So what are we suggesting is that, yeah, some of these regional areas are facing challenges that I recognise from something here in Sydney or generally from our capital cities and larger metros across Australia. And so what I'm going to be suggesting is that if I can see those signs of some of those challenges, we can ask the questions about how prepared those regional systems are to accommodate some of those challenges or to respond to some of those challenges. And so that's basically the broad structure. I guess that's sort of, I don't want to suggest that there's this sort of dichotomy, this sort of binary of capital city and everything else. That's not something I subscribe to. It's too reductive, but it's sort of a useful heuristic that I'll sort of cling to a little bit for the purpose of this presentation. But we'll see how we go. All right, so as I said, the first thing I want to talk about is some of the research that came out late last year on the floods in the Northern Rivers. Some context first, though, in setting up this binary of regional markets versus capital cities, is to sort of identify what I would call some characteristics of those regional housing systems or regional housing markets. They are obviously, because they are smaller cities and towns, they tend to be smaller housing markets. There are fewer dwellings in them. And they also tend to be more uniform. I've got one chart here, this is just lifted from the census, showing the mix of dwelling type. And so major urban, which includes Sydney, this is just New South Wales. Major urban includes Sydney, but also includes Newcastle, Wollongong. You can see there's a mix of detached housing, low rise and high rise. But as our urban areas get smaller, so the other urban areas is everything, pretty much everything else of note in New South Wales, and bounded localities tend to be smaller, under 1,000 people. But you can see as we get out of those major urban areas, the diversity of housing really starts to disappear to the point where we have effectively 1 in 5, or even only 1 in 5 or only 1 in 10 dwellings not being a detached dwelling. And similarly, there's a bunch of, there's a degree of uniformity when we look at the tenure mix. Owned properties that are owned outright or owner occupied by mortgagees as well. Again, we can see that goes from about 2/3, so it's already majority in the major urban areas, but that proportion increases the smaller the urban area gets. So we have these housing contexts where, as I say, we've got fewer dwellings, they tend to be more uniform, and they tend to be dominated by freestanding dwellings that are occupied by the owners or mortgagees. So turning attention to that research that I mentioned, what we actually did up in the Northern Rivers is we spoke to a number of service providers in the housing and social services space. There were also people we spoke to were actively involved in the response to the floods. We actually made a concerted decision not to speak to people directly affected. It was quite traumatic still for those people at the time when we were doing these interviews. So by asking people who were providing those supports to people who were directly affected, we were able to get some insights into some of the challenges that they were facing, some of those vulnerable groups were facing after the floods. up in the Northern Rivers. And a lot of these challenges were born out of what I was just showing before, the fact that these markets tend to be more homogenous and steered away from these more vulnerable, more marginal groups. So in terms of homelessness services, what we found was that there was a huge degree of diversion of services and attention away from business as usual to dealing with the floods. And that landed in a number of ways, but perhaps most, evidently and of note for this presentation is that temporary accommodation, which is part of the specialist homelessness services, got pulled in to become emergency accommodation on the back of the floods. So suddenly this supply of temporary accommodation that is part of an already strained and already difficult homelessness services sector was suddenly found a lot of their dwellings were pulled away from them. Similarly, when we're speaking to social housing providers and community housing providers, there was a similar story that the limited stock of social housing, which again was already strained before the floods, was fine. They found that there was a whole bunch of constraints on their stock. Some of it went offline, some of it was flood affected. But it was also finding that there was this huge spike in demand. People who were in need of social housing were coming forward. People who might have historically found that even though they were eligible for social housing, had their housing needs met either informally in a granny flat or somewhere else, suddenly those options were no longer available. And so there was this spike in demand for social housing as well. And so again, the system was incredibly strained. Even the private rental sector, and again, think back to those charts I was showing earlier, private rental sector is a much smaller market in these regional centres. And so what they found was that the rental market was similarly constrained. Once some supply came offline, if it was flood affected, but also there was this spike in demand for private rental as people's own homes became uninhabitable and they had to find temporary tenancy. There was this real challenge of matching supply and demand in the private rental market. And when you see this sort of already small volume of stock huge demand start to increase for this already limited supply of stock, of course, affordability comes in. And so what we found was that it was particularly at the lower cost end of the private rental market, the number of options just really disappeared. And there's a quote there, dearth of available tenancies, which was already the case beforehand, becoming more concerted after the floods. And I think one just sort of a final sort of comment on this was in these regional markets, that low cost end of the private rental market tended to be affordable to people on low and very low income. So if you're on a Centrelink payment, if you're on pension, you could generally afford a cheaper end of the private rental market in somewhere like this mall. But that was no longer the case. And so that sort of tether between low income households and the low end of the private rental market really dislocated, which is why we were seeing, as I said before, a spike in demand for social housing as well. The other finding that was interesting out of the interviews was the extent of this was a new normal. So we were speaking to people who, as this quote suggests, they set up a crisis management to deal with, I think they said they originally set it up to deal with bushfires about 5 years earlier, but it basically just lurched from one crisis to another, fire, flood, COVID, and so on. And so they basically had this temporary crisis management team in place for a number of years. And so this was the new, for their experience, this was the new normal. And that had implications for the way they operated, providing social housing, providing community services, because they were operating in this sort of perpetual state of crisis management. But once we start to think about the fact that these climate crises are the new normal, it starts to point to something that I'm going to come back to, which is the fact that this might not just be a spike. This might not be a temporary challenge for these markets. This might be something that is more structural and something that they will face over the longer term in an ongoing way. The other thing, and this is sort of outside the scope of our research, but it did pop up somewhat, is the extent to which, like, something like the increased incidence of floods, but also the increased incidence of bushfires. And I've just put up this news story because we also saw that there was incidences of trying to protect koala habitat. These are all sort of starting to amalgamate around a series of constraints on the outskirts of a lot of these regional areas. So on the outskirts of Lismore, but indeed any sort of like regional town, if anyone sort of knows sieve mapping, which is an exercise that planners used to do, so you sort of go, all right, where are we going to build? We'll start with anywhere. All right, let's eliminate the stuff that's flood prone. Let's eliminate the stuff that's bushfire prone. Let's eliminate the stuff that's koala habitat. And we have a look at what's left. That's where we'll put the new housing. But you can see increasingly we've got more and more constraints on these on the outskirts of these towns, and so it's starting to put some limitations on that growth strategy. And I'll come back to some of the challenges of rural sprawl. Just to pull a quote out of that story, it was, if anyone was following the koala wars a couple of years ago, despite the fact that the Nationals sort of pitched it as a war against farmers, really it was a war against the development industry, which was the fact that we were trying to protect some habitat on the outskirts of some of these regional areas. And so what we found for that research up in the Northern Rivers was this question of what we really mean by resilient, and this is not something new. I think it was probably nearly 15 years old now. Simone Davidi was sort of asking similar questions about this concept of resilient. But in the very practical terms, we could sort of see what that meant for the housing system in the Northern Rivers and for housing systems in regional areas generally. And it is this thing. Are we talking about the ability to withstand external pressures, so something like a bushfire, something like a flood? And some of that's got to do with the slack that's in the system. So I've already suggested there was no slack in the system, particularly when it comes to social housing, to homelessness services, to low-cost private rental. So there was sort of no slack in the system that could accommodate these external pressures or external shock. Oh, eternal should be external shocks. Sorry about that. But the other thing is this idea that we can have infrastructure in place to help withstand those external shocks. And this is actually from the New South Wales State Infrastructure Strategy from last year, which, again, is making some very similar points. Which is to say we need to have a steady supply of social housing, and they actually talk about well-maintained housing, housing that is well located and positioned so that it's not flood prone, fire prone, and so forth, is important so that the housing system is able to withstand those external shocks. But as I just suggested, that's not really the case at the moment in our regional markets. Resilient is also sometimes this idea of being able to bounce back quickly. And again, some of these smaller markets just really weren't able to do that. This is another news story. I'm just going to lean on that as evidence, with a local builder suggesting that on the back of these floods, they weren't really in a position to literally to build back quickly. Another long quote here. This one was actually out of the flood inquiry, which was, asking this question about, well, maybe we shouldn't be building back to what we were. Are we building a housing system that is able to adapt to changing systems? And the suggestion was that actually, on the back of those floods in the Northern Rivers, governance structures, support systems really weren't geared towards providing the support needed for those vulnerable households. So yes, while they had emergency centres, and yes, they set up pod villages for people to live over the medium term, there were a lot of questions about the extent to which that was appropriate for what was meeting the needs of these more vulnerable parts of the community. But all in all, that the Northern Rivers research that we did, sort of be selective in the findings that I've presented today. But, I just want to make a sort of broad argument that actually a lot of those challenges, despite the fact that it sort of reared its ugly head on the back of an acute circumstances on the back of those floods, were actually more structural issues with the housing system on the Northern Rivers, and potentially more structural challenges for regional markets generally, because they are smaller, they are more uniform, they tend to have less diversity to accommodate those more vulnerable households, particularly when those acute events emerge. So to just sort of then think about some of these more structural, as opposed to like acute one-off stresses on the housing system. As I said, what the Northern Rivers experience was that this is not a one-off. This is increasingly the new normal, as I used that language before. But there was also recognition that in those regional and remote communities, normal economic forces that might help position a housing system to withstand some of those shocks, to be more resilient, just weren't in place. Some of the other pressures that we are seeing in regional markets are just to do with population growth generally. This is actually a little bit to realise this is 10 years old. It's a quarter of my life ago. What have I been doing with it? A piece of research we did for the National Housing Supply Council, which was looking at, in particular, retirees and what their housing choices were. And one of the key things that came out of that research, and again, even when we were doing it a decade ago, it wasn't new, was this idea of sea change, tree change, people making the choice to move to regional areas out of the big cities, and the extent to that put population pressures on some of those regional centres. But what we found a decade ago was that there's a whole bunch of other cohorts that are moving to regional areas that are not really doing it out of aspiration, they're doing it out of constraint. So they are people who are renting or who have other costs or other constraints. And so they're just trying to get out of Sydney, in the case of New South Wales, or out of some more expensive market. So effectively they're retreating to these cheaper markets. The other thing that we found is that often people are retreating to or moving to locations where they can get better services upon retirement. And so in the regional context, this is the fact that we know a lot more people moving into regional centres actually come from the surrounding rural and remote areas rather than from the big city. So, the joke is that it's probably not a Toorak tractor you're seeing on, in Lismore. It's probably an actual tractor from someone that's come from a farm nearby, but they're moving into the centre because they need access to health services, community services, or whatever upon retirement. They can't maintain their lifestyle on the farm miles away from everyone else. So a lot of the people that are moving into these regional areas, and like I said, this research is actually just about retirees, but that parallels the experience of migration into these regional centres generally. Despite the fact that we tend to think of those sea change people, moving into these areas, a lot of the migration to regional centres is out of constraint. So that has implications to the sorts of people that are moving in, the sorts of housing products that you're going to need, and also the sorts of services and infrastructure you're going to need to support those incoming communities. So, in getting broad brushstrokes, you are going to need more affordable options. You are going to need more rental options potentially. You are going to need more options that are accessible, as in for people with disability or people who are getting old. So those sort of housing options are perhaps quite different to those large acreage lots that you sometimes sort of see as being for that aspirational hobby farm people moving out of the city. Slightly more recently, in fact, it's not even out yet. We recently did some research for the Greater Cities Commission, and so maybe I shouldn't be showing you this because it hasn't been published. But look, it's an impenetrable table of numbers anyway. But the key takeaway is these figures over here, and basically what we were just look at the green. The green means less than usual. Okay, and so what we found was that in the 12 months before census, which was a period affected by COVID, far fewer people who were moving house in Sydney were actually leaving Sydney. All right. So in a typical period, a lot of people who start in Sydney and move house, in fact, our benchmark was the 5 years before census. So in other words, people that moved house, lived in Sydney in 2016 and moved house some point between 2016 and 2021, certain portion of those left Sydney and moved to the regions. But during just the 12 months before census, so the COVID affected period, the proportion of people moving house that were leaving Sydney was far smaller. And so, that was quite an interesting finding. For the purpose of that research, it was really just a sense check to make sure that the work we were doing wasn't completely thrown off by anomalous patterns that were happening during COVID. But, given some of the media attention during COVID around, people escaping Sydney lockdowns and whatnot, and like blowing up, Byron-based housing market, actually, the number of people leaving Sydney was lower during that period. And that does make sense because most of us were locked down. Most of us weren't really making big life decisions. It was a fairly small number of people who could make that, discretionary decision. It wasn't one that made out of necessity, as I was showing on the previous slide. Oh, hang on, sorry, there you go. There's my point to the bit you should pay attention to. But despite the fact that, there weren't that many people leaving during COVID, there is some sense that that small number of people coming from Sydney, the sea change people moving to Byron Bay or whatever, has an outsized impact on the housing market. And it's because they come in at the top of the market. And so what that means is that the dwelling that, what once cost $1 million, they could outbid that and they'll pay 1.2 million, which means if you're coming in with $1 million and you're a local, suddenly you're having to spend that $1 million on something that used to cost $750,000. So it starts to bring everything up. So despite the fact that there might not be many sea changes, those that are coming, those aspirational people that are coming can have an outsized impact on the housing market. But like I said, that's very much a discretional spend. And the other sort of discretional spend that we're increasingly seeing is this idea of holiday homes in regional markets and all the stuff that's been going on with Airbnb and short-term accommodation. Now, this is actually from yesterday in the paper to show that it is topical. Byron Bay is looking to limit the number of days that you can put your home on something like Airbnb to 60 days because there is some sense that it was starting to eat into the long-term residential market. So again, we've got this idea of something like Airbnb as being something new. But the question is it going to be structural? Is it something that's going to stick around or is it something that's going to go away? The other thing that has a big impact on demand for housing, perversely, is the supply of money. So basically, if you can get cheap money, you can spend more on housing. In other words, when interest rates are low. So this is also something that is played out, and as a planner, I'm always keen to blame economists rather than myself. And so, we'll blame the fact that you can get cheap loans, and that's what's caused this, spiking house prices, rather than the fact that as a planner, I'm not approving enough dwellings. But we've already started to see as these interest rates go back up again, and as the cost of money starts to increase. And here's a quote from this story again, to show it's topical today. I think it's okay occasionally to use a news story to sort of just demonstrate a point. It's not particularly convincing evidence, particularly when it comes to something about housing costs in the Sydney Morning Herald, because you can probably on any given day find 5 different stories that come to 5 different conclusions. They're going up, they're going down. Whatever you need to find, you can generally find what will support your case. So I'm reluctant to use news stories like this, but this is something that is playing out more broadly, that we are seeing house prices start to temper off in some of these regional markets. And it is largely because of this discretionary spending, the holiday home, the investment property, whatever it might be, people start to retract from that space. Interestingly, despite what I was saying before about the limited number of people moving from Sydney, Terry Ronsley was quoted in this paper. He spends more time trawling through census data than me, which is, it's not many people who do that. He suggested that, yeah, okay, a lot of those folks coming out of the big city, pushing up prices is potentially coming back. So, like I said, just gonna, generally speaking, maybe we've seen the worst of the house prices going up or going up rapidly in some of these regional markets. So the sense it is cyclical and it will sort of temper off on its own. But actually, the experience from Sydney is that that's not necessarily the case, despite the fact that there might be periods where demand gets lower. No politician is ever going to countenance the idea of house prices dropping dramatically or dropping quickly if they can at all avoid it. That's how you lose elections. And so I think we're probably going to see a situation now in some of these regional markets where there will be a similar expectation that government intervention will start to prop up these markets to make sure that prices don't go down too much. And so we will, despite the fact that maybe some of those pressures, those very acute pressures are coming off, we are seeing that, the language is the financialisation of these housing markets, expectations that they are an asset class that will make money for the people that own dwellings in Vita, in Lismore, indeed anywhere other regional markets as well. So like I said, not definitive, but when I sort of read these tea leaves and think about what we've seen here in Sydney, as I can see these signs that some of these regional markets are really entering this, like I say, financialised housing market space, where high costs and fast growing costs is an expectation that policy levers are expected to perpetuate. And as I suggested before, that creates some challenges, particularly for more vulnerable households, which is what I want to talk about next. So, we have seen this situation where there's been a mismatch of supply and demand, all these pressures, population growth, Airbnb, maybe some of the interest rate impacts. There's been this mismatch of supply and demand. And so, naturally, the prices have gone up. And generally, you would expect then if supply was introduced, it would bring some balance to that mismatch to see things steady out. But a couple of important points is that we can't just start pumping, just start throwing in more houses and expecting, it to any supply to be have the same sort of impact. And this is not me founding or sort of, going against mainstream economics. There is a connection between supply and demand, but there's a couple of things you would want to see. So first of all, if I need a specific housing product, and I've got a quote here again, this is from the Northern Rivers research. But some of the other things that we saw from the Northern Rivers were people with accessibility challenges. So for example, if you were renting a dwelling and you're on a low income and you also had some mobility issues, maybe you're getting old, so you need something that's going to be level access and maybe close to shops because you can't drive, you need to be able to get a bus or whatever. Every extra sort of expectation that you put on your housing, the more niche your housing needs become, the fewer options there are. And so this is what we'll find. What we found up in the Northern Rivers is that those people with very specific housing needs, what was available to them just diminished completely. The supply was just so thin that prices just went bananas, and there was just nothing available for people that had very specific products. And so what that, again, when we're thinking about that supply and demand, we can't just expect any old dwelling that we sort of add to the market to actually make a difference to people who need some specific housing product. Similarly, in regional markets, this idea of specialisation in a small market, the lack of specialisation in a small market is something that we're going to see in these regional housing contexts. But similarly, this idea of substitution. Okay, so again, let's look at Sydney. If housing prices get too expensive in the eastern suburbs, you might move to the inner west. If it's too expensive in the inner west, you might move towards Parramatta. You can still get to your job in the CBD. But when you're in a regional context, that idea of substitution across that large geography just doesn't exist. And so again, there's a quote here from the research that we did up in the Northern Rivers, which found that, if you were looking for something more affordable, you were effectively having to go somewhere where there were no transport options. Now, if you've got a car, that's okay. But again, when we're talking about more vulnerable people who can't drive everywhere, suddenly there were no alternatives. So again, this idea of, well, we can't just start injecting supply on the outskirts of town or in one regional centre hoping that that's going to have an impact on another regional centre. And finally, we can sort of start to think about those specific price points. So again, it's a quote from the Northern Rivers. And this is what I was talking to before, this sort of breaking of the tether between people who were on a Centrelink payment, being able to afford something in the private rental market, and the fact that that bottom end of the rental market was going up dramatically to the point that there were no longer options there. We weren't seeing prices filter down, the older, cheaper stuff reaching the bottom of the market, so that there was something affordable for these households in the context of limited supply and high capital growth. There was just no evidence of any filtering of, of the older stock of the cheaper options moving down market. I'll give a little plug to some other research that we published last year. And this is a nice bit of jargon from Andy. But what this is really suggesting is that when you have high capital growth, this is, when house prices are going up, which as I'm suggesting is what is the expectation in these regional markets, before properties get cheap, someone buys it, knocks down the house and builds something new. That's it. Yeah, it's a bit more technical than that. But that's basically what it's suggesting. When you've got high capital growth, particularly when you've got a lot of owner occupation, and so people are quite prepared to wear those capital costs and not as worried about overcapitalising because they're going to do it long term, we tend not to see this filtering down. We tend not to see the housing market provide options that are naturally affordable to people on low incomes. So given all that, I'll just present some findings from that other project that I mentioned, which was the sort of census bash, where we looked at some of the degrees of rent stress. Like I said, it was a broader question of unmet housing need that, for all intents and purposes, it boiled down to the number of low-income households in the private rental market who were paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And here's the rates for some of these regional markets in New South Wales. If you look up here in this area that I've been talking about, you can see those rates are really high. So the percentage rates in each of these regions is the proportion of all households. So we've got, 1 in 12, maybe nearly 1 in 10 in somewhere like Coffs Harbour. 1 in 10 households, across all households, was currently, in rent stress. So really high rates of unmet housing needs. So like I said, if you're on a low income, degree in rent stress in the private rental market tends to suggest you're probably eligible for social or affordable housing, but there's just nothing available. And so, these rates up in the Northern Rivers are actually higher than what we saw in Sydney. Sydney as a whole was about 7.5%. Obviously, some pockets of Sydney were higher than that. But the fact that we've got regional areas with figures that are higher, that are in excess of that, really shows that there are a lot of these affordability constraints, as I was showing earlier, starting to hit these regions. Interestingly, this analysis that we did last year was an update on something we'd done 5 years earlier. And again, it speaks to this idea that maybe it's not some short-term peak. This is a longer-term structural challenge because the levels are generally pretty, if they're high, they generally have been high for at least 5 years. We found similar rates 5 years ago. In some cases, things have improved slightly. So this is showing the number of dwellings, number of households that had unmet housing needs in 2016 and a number in 2021. You can see in some cases it's gone down, which seems to counter everything we're hearing about the fact that we're in an acute period where affordability is at its worst. Incomes haven't gone up, but rents have. So why is the rates of rent stress steady? Been steady or maybe marginally improved? And again, we saw some evidence of what was happening in the Northern Rivers research, jumping between the two projects now, which is that people were basically just moving to where housing costs are cheaper. And that's sort of sensible. Again, as I said before, that's what you would see in Sydney. You would expect people to, sort themselves to where housing options that are available to them are suitable to them. But actually, in the context of some of these regional markets, it means moving a long way from your existing networks, your existing support services, your existing family and friends, probably your existing jobs. So, you're potentially having to move, change jobs, and really disrupt your life to find something more affordable or to get yourself out of rent stress. So despite the fact that, there might have been some marginal improvement in some instances between the two censuses, really what that is a function of it's a function of dysfunction. It's a result of the dysfunction in the housing market. This sort of share one more finding from the census batch, which is to look at this composition. So we actually can see what different household types had unmet housing needs, and you can see in a lot of these regional markets, lone persons or singles were really overrepresented in that unmet need. Interestingly, when the overall rates increased, so places like Richmond, like Coffs, it tends to start affecting families more. But in regions that were arguably more affordable, where the rates of unmet need were lower overall, we start to see singles come through. And again, the reason I wanted to point to this one is to sort of circle back to what I was suggesting before about sort of often retirees or people are living by themselves, coming in from the farm or whatever, and also circle back to that idea that we don't have a lot of housing diversity in these markets. So if you live by yourself, there's not a huge number of small studio apartments that are available for you to rent. You're effectively having to compete with everyone else for a large family home. And that's why you've got these high rates of unmet housing need in for single people. Come back to that as well. So like I said, generally regional markets have been an affordable alternative, and that has driven a lot of the movement in case New South Wales from Sydney to the regions, and that's the case for other capitals and their regions as well, and other parts of Australia. But arguably that difference is closing, and I don't just mean in price point. I mean that difference in like the lifestyle it affords you or the options that are available to you, and so suddenly you're not going to be able to get out of rent stress by moving to some of these regional markets, which of course means those vulnerable households are left with nowhere to go, and so they're having to stay in rent stress for other vulnerable housing situations. All right, the last thing I want to talk through then is what are we going to do about this? And I think sort of my overarching thesis here is that, okay, some of the symptoms of some of the challenges that these regional markets are facing are things that we've seen in Sydney before. Arguably, some of the responses that we have in Sydney just aren't available because we don't have that degree of substitution, we don't have that depth, that specialisation, the diversity in the housing markets. So option one is sprawl. I already mentioned before that there's some challenges to this. As we take flood-prone land, we take bushfire-prone land, we take koala habitat off the table, suddenly your sprawl options are limited. I tend not to shy away from the word sprawl. I think planners are reluctant to be too pejorative these days because they keep doing it. So they tend to call it land release or horizontal expansion or something else like euphemistic, because sprawl has these terrible connotations. But in many instances, whatever name you give it, still has it's still quite problematic. I also quite like a little bit of alliteration, and you'll see I've stuck with the S theme for some of these options. So yes, we're going to see some sprawl in these regional areas, but it's not going to be as effective as you might think it could be, because you have all these constraints. The areas where you're going to see supply are going to be a bit more patchy. You can't optimize for getting everything around a single sort of transit corridor or something else that you might do to minimize the impacts of your sprawl. So what we're seeing is this sort of more patchy, bit by bit, this piecemeal expansion into areas that can accommodate it. I mean, this is just one that I've just picked from Maitland Council. I don't mean to pick on Maitland, but I do spend a bit of time trawling through the planning portal to see what's happening out there, and this is the sort of thing we're seeing a lot of. The other thing that you can see here, and I can tell you because I've read this, half of this site is actually going to be maintained to protect that habitat.
But that sort of then means you've got to, for a landowner, they've got to get their yield on the other half. And so you're going to start to see some challenges there because of those restrictions on where development can happen and what sprawl is available to you. I think the other challenge that you are going to see in some of these regional markets, particularly as the heat comes off, is, okay, I'm now pursuing, and like I said, I'm seeing a lot of stuff on a lot of rezonings happening on the outskirts of these regional centres in the planning portal in New South Wales. And a lot of that is because we have seen prices go up. So suddenly, a lot of these sites are suddenly getting tipped into the feasible jar. Okay, development on my farm is now feasible because of the prices I can sell those dwellings for. But if that heat comes off those markets, and if we're suddenly finding that the yields are going to be limited because half of it has to be dedicated koala habitat, then you end up with this, what I call the feasibility Ouroboros. If anyone wants to get a tattoo, that's what you know what to ask for now, which is this idea that, okay, feasibility is not stacking up because house prices are retreating, or I've paid too much for land as a developer. So I'm going to be looking for higher densities. I'm going to be looking for a product that maybe doesn't sell for as high a price. So I'm going to target a different market, maybe a cheaper product on a smaller lot. I can get twice as many. But then suddenly I'm like, oh, okay, that's not feasible anymore because, the amount I can get from because of squeezing so many in, it's not as an appealing product. Okay, no, I need to sort of go slightly higher density, or no, I need to sort of like pursue. And so you see this feasibility Ouroboros where people start to sort of move down market rapidly. And so the outcome on some of these sites is not that aspirational, suburban development that you might have historically seen in some sprawl, but increasingly something that is dominated by private rental, by low-income households who are just looking for something cheap on the outskirts of town. And so again, this is something we've seen in Sydney. This is just another piece of research that was published, but it was actually based on some old census data, where we actually found that, like, when you look at where private rental is growing in Sydney, it's actually growing in the outskirts of the city, and it's growing in the poorer parts of the city, the more disadvantaged parts of the city. And so again, some of these housing estates, the Aurum Parks of the world, they are not the aspirational, higher tier product. People going, well, I'm going to trade up and move further out. It's now increasingly, an affordable product for people who can't get anything else closer. And so again, using the lessons of what we've seen in Sydney, I suspect we're going to see some of that in the regional markets, which has big implications because you are basically starting to sort, as I said before, people who are going, who are more vulnerable, who need access to services, who are going to need job opportunities to stay ahead. They're getting moved away from those services, from those job opportunities, because that's where housing is cheaper. So this is sort of, like I say, a potential social impact of sprawl. I already sort of alluded to the environmental impacts of sprawl, particularly koala habitat. And don't want to get political, but the Greens have been monitoring this too. Kate Fayman, the New South Wales MP, had released a report late last year that also identified this, that a lot of those land release areas, she's been calling them zombie DAs, are potentially going to have huge environmental impacts. So even if the business model stacks up, even if we can put the necessary social infrastructure in place, given that the communities are going to skew to more disadvantaged, still potentially going to be huge environmental impacts. We're basically, banking on the fact that, these communities have access to electric cars and solar panels and everything else, because otherwise it's going to be all those environmental challenges that the reason we sort of have been disparaging sprawl for 20, 30 years already. And again, just to sort of point to something that I alluded to earlier, it is very hard to put this genie back in the bottle when there's an expectation that you can get a certain yield on a parcel of land. The expectation is every policy decision will maintain that. So just again, lessons from Sydney, we've seen that. So basically around the airport, they did a rezoning exercise, rezoned a whole bunch of areas, got upzoned. Hey, this is where we want the development around the airport to happen. But there were other areas that didn't get upzoned. And the guys that didn't get upzoned were considered theft. I think this particular quote is someone that got zoned for environmental protection, so they were particularly appalled because they weren't going to see a lot of development on their parcel of land. But what it means is that, any sort of expectation, it's very hard to undo that. Okay, maybe it makes sense to put housing there now, but if in 5 years' time, it doesn't make sense, landowners and developers are not going to just sit there and go, okay, I took a punt, didn't work out. Okay, I'm happy with that. No, absolutely not. Like I said, key here is the political economy. The expectation is going to be that, the governments pull all their levers to maintain the feasibility and the development prospects of these sites. So that's sprawl. Notwithstanding my cynicism and my concerns, you are probably going to see some instances of quasi-retirement, sea change sorts of developments and fairly stuff happening on the fringe in a lot of these regional markets. It's going to happen. Probably some of it's going to be okay, but my concern is that that's not what we're going to see a lot of the time. The other response is, another response is to inject some more social housing. Look, I mean, again, I'm not suggesting anything new here. Sprawl is certainly not a new policy response. Social housing is not a new policy response. These are, some of them are certainly out of fashion, but, like I said, these are things that regional areas are going to have to turn to where they haven't historically needed to. When you've got to see high population growth, you've got to see costs escalating faster than incomes. Suddenly the regional market's going to be turning to policy options that they have historically not needed to. And so again, this is the chart I had up earlier. These are areas that haven't historically needed particularly high levels of social housing because the private rental market's been able to meet the needs of a lot more, of a larger proportion of people. But as I say, prices escalate, rents exceed income growth, rental growth exceeds income growth. We're going to see more need for social housing. That has its own challenges. These are areas, if there's not areas where there's typically been a lot of social and affordable housing built historically, but even recently, then this is going to be areas where potentially the community housing sector is not going to have capacity to get out there, buy sites, do development, particularly when a lot of it is constrained by floods, by fire and whatnot. And something that came out late last year was a suggestion that the government just goes and buys market housing, hand it over to community housing providers as an affordable product, which is an incredibly inefficient way of bringing social and affordable housing stock, into the system. Again, just a bit of a plug for some other research that we did a few years ago. I'm in the et al. In this instance. In a regional market, your costs are probably going to be lower for a development. And so the subsidy gap to what is affordable to someone on low income is going to be smaller. Somewhere like Sydney, the costs of bringing a product online are going to be massive. Land costs, development costs if you're building high rise or whatever. Your cost per dwelling is really high, but the income, and that someone on a low income can pay. Sorry, the rent that someone on a low income can pay is is sort of fixed down there. So you've got this big gap that you need to fill. Now in a regional market, that gap becomes big. But you also have fewer options that are available to you. The reason it's so high in somewhere like Sydney is largely because of land costs. So we have mechanisms to provide land cheaper. Government-owned land, exclusionary zoning, whatever else. That's not going to make a huge difference up there. One of the other challenges has been cheap financing costs for community housing sector. When they start to develop at scale in Sydney, they can generally get cheaper financing, but that's not available if it's a smaller, I don't want to say two-bit operator, but an outfit that's operating in a regional context doesn't have that scale and capacity as a developer, community housing provider as a developer. But something like NIVIC, something like NRES will make a difference in those regional markets. But the extent to which, again, because these are not areas we've traditionally tried to inject social and affordable housing, that means a lot of the subsidy that we provide are not geared towards those market contexts. I am not an expert on Indigenous housing, and I really just wanted to hang a lantern on this because it is also going to be a very big problem in regional areas. I'm just going to leave it at that. Something that, unfortunate, but I don't have answers to that. Option 3, I'm suggesting is what's got a lot of names. Again, I've gone for something in S, which is suburban retrofit. Which is the idea that we just sort of do this incremental redevelopment of low density residential areas. So as I said, that basically what dominates regional markets. So you've got a lot of opportunities to inject some more housing diversity into those contexts, particularly when you consider what I was saying before about the lack of options for people living on their own, a lack of small dwellings. This is something that really needs to be considered a lot more in regional markets. But again, you know, I'm just repeating the slide from before, or at least the graphic from before. We've already seen that, you know, there are constraints on the construction sector capacity in these regional markets. So the idea that they're going to be able to gear up and start building duplexes and small walk-up apartments and whatnot is questionable. I think we also saw in Sydney, when we started shifting towards this sort of suburban retrofit, that some of the first people to move into that space were cowboys, basically. And so you sort of, you know, because it was very much driven through a deregulation, there was a lot of garbage that was built, which, you know, raised a lot of community concerns about the sort of missing middle. And so you're going to see that in regional markets as well. Particularly because, and again, just to plug for another paper that I had published earlier this year, you know, because it's so politically poisonous to be talking about injecting new housing into existing suburbs, there's this desire amongst planners to sort of try and do it stealthily, to sort of just try and sneak it in and hope no one will notice. My sort of leitmotif on this is that you wouldn't put 1,000 dwellings on an old farm, you wouldn't put 1,000 apartments on an old factory site without doing some strategic planning. Yet we're sort of trying to squeeze 1,000 dwellings into an existing suburb and hope no one will notice. So it's often happening without good strategic planning, because it's happening in this sort of context of just deregulation, just getting out of the way and just letting some cowboys build stuff that might not be a great outcome. And so that lack of, you know, maybe planning capacity at the local scale sort of, you know, expands to other challenges that are going to be happening in these regional contexts. Regional councils tend not to have the capacity, you know, or the resources that urban ones do. So recently, we've seen the Department of Planning here in New South Wales have a regional housing flying squad. They're basically like FIFO planners to come in and do the development assessment, which is again sort of problematic. You've also got, I can tell you, you know, because I trawl the planning portal a lot, you've got sort of Sydney consultants flying in and on behalf of the developers and running rings around local councils that have absolutely no resources. And so what you're going to see is that, yeah, the local communities and like local knowledge and local context gets ignored by this much more technocratic approach to a development assessment and approval, because the local councils don't have capacity. I'm not going to go into this at all, other than to say, if you have a look at the problems that the audit office highlighted, they are almost exclusively, with the exception of Strathfield, which is a bit of a bust case here in Sydney, they're almost exclusively the regional councils that have had problems. So again, there's some financial constraints in these regional councils. So I was actually storing the paper today about Geelong, that's go bankrupt as well. So again, it's not a New South Wales story. And yet these regional councils, just to bring it full circle, I think it's just about my last slide, one eye at a time. You know, full circle, we're expecting local councils, particularly in the regions, to be having to like take on a much larger remit, whether it's to deal with bushfire management, to deal with floods, to provide those community support services, you know, on the back of, you know, a whole bunch of those additional challenges that they're facing in regional areas. And so we've got, you know, a lot of challenges, but, you know, one option is to really increase the capacity of local councils. So look, like I said, I'm going to finish there because I'm full out. You know, like I said at the beginning, my sort of overarching sort of theory here is, my hypothesis is that these regional markets are going to face some significant challenges that are akin to what we've seen here in Sydney. And we haven't always got good solutions for it here in Sydney, but when we have found solutions, some of those are not really going to be available in the regions. So, you know, generally I think it's called Beduge's law of headlines. I asked, are regional systems well positioned to these challenges? No, it's sort of the short version there.
Thanks, Ryan. Let's see, we just have a couple minutes, but I noticed there's a hand up and maybe something in the chat. So Richard, who is that? Right. Or if you've got your hand up, feel free to turn your microphone on, ask Ryan. While we're waiting, anybody in the room have a question? Yeah, Chris.
Thanks for your presentation. Just wondering, sort of the implications of, you touched upon Airbnb and, obviously Byron Bay, it's always in the news around the issues of short-term rental. Have you looked at, I guess, the sort of, at the ABS data sort of shows there isn't, that much happening over the 5-year period. Looking at second, like investment properties and those sorts of things, and it seems like, as you talk to some of those factors, they're being sort of like, small changes can have profound effects. So have you looked at sort of, I don't know, it's the rise of more investment properties or, and what that impact might be, whether they're on the short-term rental market or not, having a sort of a swing of increased investment properties in regional areas, what's that doing in the housing market?
The short answer is no, I haven't crunched the data on that. I'm not sure how that got through, but there would be other data sources that can tell you that. But yeah, I think like the broader trend towards, as I said, like a financialization of these regional housing markets, the expectation that it is an asset class, whether it's short-term rental accommodation, whether it's like I'm buying a holiday home, so I'm expecting capital growth on that holiday home. So it's an investment as much as it is discretionary spending. So there is, a number of forces, a number of sort of like manifestations of a single force, which is this idea of an expectation that you can make money in housing market. Whereas historically, regional markets have been more stable, have been more steady, have not seen those sort of crazy levels of growth. Yeah, so I think I haven't got the numbers, but yeah, there's a few things pointing towards that. And yeah, as I was saying before, that's going to have an outsized impact on price, even if it's small. Chris, you have looked at Airbnb.
Can you say again, what was the period where you had that measurement of how often properties were, well, not properties, households were moving, and it was actually, you were suggesting that it was less than they were moving before it was broken. What was the 12 months before census?
So census asks two questions: where you were 5 years ago, and where you were 1 year ago. So in the context of 2021, that's where you were in 2020, and where you were in 2016. So we looked at like the movement, number of people who moved house in the 5-year period. Starting in Sydney, you moved house, what proportion of those movers left Sydney? So that's what gives us our baseline. Then we asked that same question just for the 12 months. People that moved in the 12 months, started in Sydney, moved house, what proportion of them left Sydney? And it was lower than the 5-year period. So it was underrepresented in that 12 months.
So there was I did a seminar presentation in this series a little while ago. One of the charts I showed was there's a big bump in property transfers in ABS property in their residential price series. They have a property transfers figure, and there's jumps up in that period. So I wondered if that was movers, but it might be holiday house buyers.
Yeah, I also think that it's more, it's discretionary spending. So yeah, some people probably did move to their holiday home, bought the holiday home and moved there, but that wasn't their permanent residence. And so may or may not have been there on census night. But yeah, there was definitely, and we've just seen prices go up. And you need transactions for that to happen to see that sort of come through. And so yeah, that's
Pieces of the puzzle coming together.
I think we've got a question online from Tony.
Yes, I was wondering if you could comment on what happens in the southern United States, where they do allow what you call sprawl, but I suppose a better word is spread, and allow any sort of landowner on the periphery to subdivide subject to reasonable constraints. And the result is that you get equivalent housing there for about a third of what it costs in Sydney, like, for example, Dallas. Why can't that sort of freeing up land on the outskirts be done in this part of the world?
Thanks, Tony. Look, I first of all, I have limited knowledge of the specifics of Dallas, but what I do know of in America is that when they allow, call it sprawl, when they allow that sort of development on the outskirts of town, often it's not serviced by infrastructure. So the developers have to do all their own roads, they do all their own sewage, they often have on-site sewage and water and whatnot. So basically they're sort of, having to provide all their own infrastructure to make that happen. And we don't do that in Australia. So in Australia, what we would typically do is we would be providing all that infrastructure. If we're not recouping the cost of that infrastructure through the development, which is one of the challenges of some of this suburban sprawl or rural sprawl, is that it's only feasible on the outskirts of town because a lot of those costs of providing infrastructure are being met by someone else.
Yes, well, the developers in the United States do supply the local infrastructure, and apparently they fund it by means of tax-free bonds, and the people that buy the properties pay this off in time, and even so, the cost or the whole cost there is about 1/3 of the equivalent properties in Sydney and the other capital cities in Australia to the same extent. So I'm just wondering why this couldn't be investigated.
Yeah, well, like I said, it would be a very significant departure from the role of governments in providing infrastructure and funding infrastructure in Australia.
Yes, well, the thing is that our efforts so far to mitigate the high cost of housing haven't succeeded. So maybe they should consider something a little more wider and at cost then thinking more broadly.
Sure.
Great. Was there another one?
There's a mix who might also have a question, but meanwhile, I knew so if you wanted to ask, you can mention overseas. Some places they have a requirement when you make a development that it includes so many low-cost housing or public housing within the development. Does that happen much here? And is that?
It doesn't happen much here. There are some, it's called inclusionary zoning, broadly speaking. We have some instances of it in Sydney, City of Sydney, for example. But we tend not to do it particularly effectively or particularly consistently in Australia or even in New South Wales. And as I was saying before, those like often that sort of on the outskirts of town, the margins are pretty thin. And the land is a much smaller proportion of your overall costs, and that's not really where inclusionary zoning is going to have particularly profound impact on the delivery of low-cost accessible affordable housing.
Yes, Max. Yeah, I just got his hand up. Max, did you have a question?
Oh, yes. This sort of arrives and comes out of a study I did many years ago in Victoria, but one of the problems in constraints on developing new housing in small country towns, such as we're looking at, was the availability of trades and so on. That say, for example, in a relatively small environment, there was one electrician and or even two or three. But the problem was, as the builder developed, he needed to have the electrical work done before he could go on to the next stage. And so there was this hold up there. And I was just wondering whether did you look at these sorts of things? It's not just the electrician, of course, it's a whole lot of trades and so on, but it was the scarcity of trades. And I imagine with the trying to overcome the floods and so on crisis, that this whole problem would be exacerbated. There just aren't enough of the trades. One of the issues that even if you tried to bring the trades in, there was nowhere for them to live in the short term. So did you ever look at anything around those issues?
Yeah, so that definitely came up in the Northern Rivers. So, and there was a slide that sort of alluded to it, which was the fact that that sort of spike in demand for construction just was not being met with supply. And yeah, look, I mean, I've been talking about housing markets being much smaller. Labour markets are also much smaller, and so you're not having that degree of specialisation, or that sort of the amount of slack in the system to sort of take up when there's a spike in demand for construction. So yeah, definitely that's one of the challenges.
Just
One more remark came through just now on the chat. It would be interesting to bring more qualitative data into the discussion, particularly around NIMBYism, urban character, community mindsets around this, and how these might shift over time.
Yeah, I don't like the word NIMBYism. It plays the man rather than the ball. But no, I think more broadly speaking, though, there are expectations in regional towns, and as I've said, there's a long history of it being dominated by freestanding family owner-occupied homes. And so, yeah, there is going to have to be, a big adjustment in expectations if we're seeing any sort of missing middle or any sort of suburban retrofit in those regional areas. And it's been hard enough in Sydney, where we already have perhaps more infrastructure to support that sort of infill, where we already have a history of that sort of infill going back to the 70s. But in a regional context, yeah, the community sentiment is going to be very different around suburban retrofit. So as I suggested, these options that are available in Sydney might not be available in some regional areas. So I think, yeah, that idea around what communities expect in terms of character, also in terms of infrastructure provisions to support infill is something that's going to be difficult in those contexts.
Great. Well, given that we're a little over time, I think we'll wrap it up there. So thanks again, Ryan, for that great presentation and lots of great content. So thanks again. And as I mentioned, this is our last seminar for the term. Our next seminar will be on June 2nd. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks.